Soviets spend an 8th activation to activate the units of the northern front for attack. Here we will see 2 attacks, an attack against this isolated German cavalry division and against the 32nd Infantry Division. The attack against the isolated cavalry division, it's a 4-to-1 attack, -1 because it is in woods, and then there's a +1 because the unit is isolated. So it's 4-to-1 with no modification. The result is a 2. Defender retreats 1 hex. Defender is isolated, cannot retreat, so it is eliminated. And the Soviet breakthrough unit advances 2 hexes, a vacated hex and 1 extra hex to the southwest. Now to the attack on the 32nd German Infantry Division. A 3-to-1 attack, the Germans are in woods with a -1 die roll modifier. A 6 modified to a 5, DR2. So the German unit is retreated 2 hexes and it is flipped to its disrupted side. And that concludes the attack or attacks of the northern front. That concludes the combat phase for the Soviets in turn 4. They destroyed total of 6 German divisions during this turn. So even though some attacks that were supposed to succeed failed, it was still a bloody nose inflicted on the Germans. Now we proceed to the first shock army withdrawal phase. And if the Soviets withdraw the first shock army, you can see that they're going to lose a lot of steam in that offensive. And here we see the penalties for staying in the game. If it is withdrawn now, there's no victory point penalty. If it stays for turn 5, 1 victory point is lost, and you see additional victory points lost for each turn up to turn 9. So should I stay or should I go? First shock army. And the Soviets decide to keep it in the game for at least 1 turn. So that means that the Soviets lose 1 victory point, and we'll make a reminder of that. I made a mistake. The Soviets should not have any action points left. I forgot to attribute an action point for the attacks of the WR front. I will do so now. It won't affect the game. So the Soviets don't have any activation points left. And so there will be no airborne phase. Actually, the rules state that as for partisans, that each turn you have to roll to see where the partisan unit for each turn is placed. So we will do that now. For turn 4, we will roll 1d6 and see where the partisan unit will be placed. And notice that on the map there are certain areas, wooded areas, that have numbers. Like you see there, number 5, number 3, 2, and 1. So we roll 1d6 and determine in which of those wooded areas a partisan unit will be placed. And we're talking specifically of the partisan unit for turn number 4. So we roll 1d6 and the roll is a 6. So this partisan unit will be placed in a partisan area number 6, which is the southernmost area. We see it here. It's to the southwest of Roslav, and it can be placed in any wooded hex that comprises this area. So the unit will be placed in this hex here. Now we go to the recovery phase. And the only disrupted Soviet units are those that participated in the failed attack against the surrounded panzer divisions around Uvaruka, and now we flip them to their non-disrupted sides. And that's the end of the recovery phase, and that's the end of Soviet turn number 4. We start with the German activation point phase. Here we see the situation in destroyed units. The Germans have lost 15, and the Soviets earn a victory point for each 5. So there's 3 victory points on account of German units destroyed. The Soviets have only lost 4. We move on to German turn number 4, and the Germans receive 5 activation points. The Germans didn't have any activation points left for their previous turns, so they have 5 for this turn. Now we move on to the German movement phase. Here we see the area around Sukinichi. The Soviets, of course, want to advance in two directions: to the northwest towards Spas-Demensk, worth 2 victory points, but also to the southwest of Sukhinichile's Bryansk, which is 3 victory points for the Soviets. Now, the Soviets have been advancing in sparse formation. They haven't consolidated their units. The Germans could conceivably move units of their 2nd Panzer Army and even counterattack if they have enough activation points, which is always a problem with the Germans at this stage, where they have so few of them. So the Germans spend their first activation point to activate the units of the 2nd Panzer Army for movement. Here we see the 2nd Panzer Army holding the victory point city of Orel. 2 victory points for the Germans. They can fall back a little towards Bryansk in order to shorten the line and perhaps allow some of their units to execute an attack on that weak Soviet infantry unit that crossed the river and is south of Kirov. So here are the position of these 2nd Panzer Army units at the beginning of the movement phase. And here are the positions after movement. Still yet to move are 2nd Panzer Army units that are in the vicinity of Kirov. Those, together with the 18th Panzer Division here near Spas-Demensk, will now move. And we see here that these 3 divisions have fallen upon the hapless, weak Russian infantry division. This is going to be a 4-to-1 attack with no modification, which seems a pretty hopeful attack for the Germans, if they can spend an activation point for those purposes. You see here that the units of the 4th Army are holding the line pretty well. No major gaps, so no activation points will be used to move them. The situation is different in the sector of the 4th Panzer Army, which suffered very heavy losses in this turn. So the Germans spend their 2nd activation point to activate the units of the 4th Panzer Army for movement. Here we see the situation around Uvaruka, which is not even a victory point city. We see the exposed units here of the 4th Panzer Army. These 2 panzer divisions were subject to an attack. They miraculously repulsed the attackers, so it's a good idea to move them back. The victory point city, which is nearest here, is Gatsk, which is 2 victory points for the Germans, and there's also a river in between, so it's a pretty solid defensive position to fall back upon, as well as these other units of the 4th Panzer Army. They could fall back and use these wooded hexes behind the river to strengthen their defense and also protect the victory point town of Rezev. So here are the positions of the 4th Panzer Army before movement, and here we see the positions after movement. Falling behind, they have given up Uvaruka and falling behind this river in wooded terrain. And now we take a look at the forces of the 9th Army. Units of the 9th Army have held well their positions, but they're about to reach the breaking point, and the Soviets have concentrated very strong forces near Rezev. So the Germans will spend their 3rd activation point to activate the units of the 9th Army for movement. So here we see the units of the 9th Army. They want to disengage from the powerful units of the Kalinin and WR front, so that at least the Soviets have to spend activation points to move those forces. So these are the positions of the 9th Army unit before movement. And here are the positions before movement. Notice that some units did not move to preserve these solid positions behind the river line. We have a unit in Rezev and units behind rivers and also in wooded terrain. And this takes us now further to the north. We have the units of the reserve group, which are facing the northern front. The Russians have eliminated a unit that was surrounded here, a cavalry unit, and have strong forces in the north now. But luckily for the Germans, the front is narrow and they can probably seal it for now by concentrating and moving some troops into specific hexes. So the Germans use their fourth activation point to activate the units of their reserve formation or group for movement. Here we see the position of the German reserve units in the north before movement and the position of the units after movement. They have practically fallen back to positions either behind rivers or in wooded hexes. That would force the northern front to move, burn an activation point to move. The Russians won't have as many activation points now in the next turns as they did at the beginning of the game. Also, it's important to note that the reserve group has other units in other areas of the board, like we see here. And this is the position of these two German divisions before movement and now after movement, as well as the 208th German Infantry Division before movement and after movement. Finally, we have here the 246th Infantry Division before movement and after movement. Now we move on to the German combat phase. They have one activation point left. And we see a combat situation here to the south of Kirov. Germans spend their last activation point to activate the 2nd Panzer Army for attack. And it is important to note that in this game, Panzer divisions, those are the black German units, can be activated for attack without activation points. So we could conceivably see the Panzer divisions of the 4th Army attacking without them being activated. Of course, because the odds are not in the Germans' favor, we won't be seeing that specific attack. But for now, it's going to be the attack here by 3 German units, 2 Panzer Grenadier and 1 Panzer Division against a weak Soviet infantry unit. This is a 4-to-1 attack without any modification. So we roll 1d6 and the Germans also roll a 1. And that's an exchange. So that means that the defending Soviet unit is eliminated and the vacated hex is not occupied by the surviving German units. And that's the end of the German combat phase. As I stated before, we could conceivably see Panzer divisions attacking now without the need of an activation point, but Panzer divisions are not in contact with Soviet units, and those that are do not have any favorable odds. That's the end of the German combat phase. And now to the German recovery phase. And the Germans do have a disrupted unit, that is the 32nd Infantry Division, which is now flipped to its undisrupted side. So that's the end of the German turn and the end of turn number 4. Next turn is turn number 5. We will most likely see the departure of the 1st Shock Army of the Soviets, that powerful 20 combat strength factor unit. Will that affect the advance of the Soviet units on their way to Rezev? And remember that those victory point cities in black only score victory points for the Germans if they hold them. The Soviets score victory points, add victory points by capturing the ones in red. So the Soviets have to penetrate a lot deeper than where they are. And you see there's a lot of red colored cities to the right edge of the board. And the Soviets, the closest they have come to any of those is Spas-Demensk, worth 2 victory points, and they are 4 hexes away from it. But the Germans are holding fast. So stay tuned for turn number 5 of Red Winter. This is Stuka Joe, signing off for now. Thanks for watching.